Hey, what is up, everyone? This is Jake Hofer with Exodus Trail Cameras. Today we have a brand new video version of our podcast, Trail Cam Radio. It is with Aaron from the Hunting Public. We recorded this after we shot the Whitetail Cribs episode with these guys, so if you haven't done so, be sure to check that out. It'll be linked right here on the video where you can click it, and it'll also be in the description below. And this particular interview is all about reading deer sign throughout the year. So we start the conversation on how to read deer sign in March and throughout the spring and so on. So really good conversation. We hope you guys enjoy it. If you do, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to help us out. And let's get into the podcast.
Lights,
Camera,
follow the trail.
ready to shoot.
If you know where a deer's bedding and you know where he's eating, that deer should be dead.
Camera.
If you're passive on a deer, what you're doing is you're teaching them.
I've got 30 bucks in the Michigan record book. Everyone but one has had at least one previous wound on his body. Some had as many as 4.
Trail Cam Radio from the guys at Exodus.
All right, we are live. We just finished up recording a Whitetail Cribs here at Aaron's house. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, dudes.
It was a lot of fun. We're looking forward to releasing it. I don't know if this will come out before or after, but regardless, be sure to check it out on the channel. We wanted to just sit down semi-quick. I know you got a lot of things to do today, but we wanted to talk about interpreting deer sign kind of basically throughout a full calendar. And being that it's March and a lot of people are postseason scouting, there's a lot of people out walking, scooping up sheds, hopefully. I guess you just want to dive right into it, everyone?
Yeah, welcome to my humble abode.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for having us, man.
Yeah, no problem.
It's cool to sit down.
I just told you guys, like, we're sitting on Sam Solholt's couch, who's a friend of mine that's an Instagram influencer and photographer now, kind of out west. And he lived here back in 2011 when I moved in here. Yeah.
It's kind of cool to, like, as we were filming Whitetail Cribs, just going over some of the stuff that's in the living room. It's like, well, this is from, Pat, or this is from this intern, or this is from this guy.
Oh, yeah.
It's like a relic of collections.
Yeah, I got that elk over there. I killed that thing in 2016, but before that, I actually just had a poster of an elk that Sam left. And because that's how he's like, what do you want? Because I'll leave you everything that I have, because he was moving out and at the end of the internship. He's like, I'm going to leave a bunch of stuff here unless you don't want it. I'm like, I don't want very much. I want your griddle so I can cook eggs, and I want your couch, and I want that elk poster because I'll probably never kill one. But then I killed an elk eventually and took his poster down. But
Did you mail it back to him?
yeah, no, I threw it in the trash. I think I might have asked him though if he wanted it back. So that was
funny.
Courteous, but yeah. Yeah, a lot of memories here. But anyway.
Yeah, it's been a kind of a proving ground or birthplace for a lot of different people that have gone on to do pretty cool things.
Yeah.
So I guess it's March right now. What are you looking at, or what are you putting value in as you're out walking, pieces of ground this time of year, and as far as what are you putting value in as far as deer sign that you're finding right now here in March?
Right now, I was just talking to Chad a while ago about this. Like, I go shed hunting too, I guess, if you will, like a lot of other folks do. But I don't ever find any antlers, it seems like. I just end up scouting the whole time. So what we're looking for this time of year, and the advantages you have this time of year is, you don't have all the foliage on and stuff. So, and you can see last year's rut sign way better than you could if you went out in the middle of the summer. It's still semi-fresh. It's only a few months old at this point. So we go out there and we dive straight in the middle of the bedding areas right now. We try to cover as much ground as we possibly can at this time of year and basically iron out the entire access route, setup, everything right now. But when it comes to deer sign, most of it that we're looking for never changes, regardless of the time of the year. We're always looking for bedding areas, actual deer beds, rubs, tracks, trails, scrapes, and so on and so forth. But when we find it this time of year, we're paying more attention to when the sign was left. So, like, if there is a cluster of rubs there that still has some bark shavings on the ground and stuff in February and March, And I mean, the rubs may just look fresher. If you find a good cluster of rubs, you know how you find like a bunch of like little willow trees along the edge of a bedding area or whatever, and there'll be 8 or 10 rubs on them sometimes. Some of them will be old rubs from years past. Some of them will be fairly fresh. If you get to looking at those in detail, sometimes you can even tell like what time of the year they were made last fall, because bucks start rubbing, in September when the velvet comes off. And they rub somewhat clear up until they lose their antlers. So that's just a rub, for example. So when you come across that type of sign, you're trying to determine about what time of year it was left. And I'll use a quick example here that's more situation specific. But if you're scouting an oak flat right now that has some remnants of acorns from last fall, and you find a bunch of rubs in there from last fall and maybe a few scrapes that are sealed over that were made in late November or around Halloween or whatever, there's a real good chance all that sign was laid down last fall during, October, when there was a bunch of acorns in that area, or late September. And that's the sort of stuff that we're trying to identify. We're basically just backdating all that sign and then trying to figure out when it was left there and under which scenario or situation it was left. At times you'll hunt floodplain areas where maybe in the fall there was a big rain event or something, and it pushed a bunch of water up into bedding areas, and it forced deer into one particular location for weeks, maybe even a couple months in the fall. And you might run across a lot of deer sign there right now that was left there from last fall. Well, if you're not thinking about when it was left and why it was left during that time, and you just go back to hunt that in the middle of the fall, there's a real good chance that the deer won't be there. They're constantly moving around. So regardless of when we're scouting, especially this time of year, I would say we're relating that back to when it was left and what the situation was when they left it.
Are you guys with some of the situation you just described, with like some of the variables that are moving deer into certain areas, are you going back and actually looking at like those weather occurrences, if that is something that's in your mind, like so you are actually looking at that, not just going in next fall and saying, okay, there's no deer here, let's move on to the next spot?
Right. And the same, I equate sign to trail camera pictures as well. I mean, it's all scouting, right? So when we check our cameras that have been left all fall, when we're out there scouting, shed hunting this time of year, we'll get pictures of a deer in a particular area, maybe say a bunch of pictures in late October. And in and around that camera in that bedding area, whatever, there'll probably be a bunch of rubs and scrapes left around that time. Good chance he was there working those rubs and scrapes in that same area during that time frame. But what we're doing is going back on Wonderground and looking at historical data then, trying to understand like what was going on, what type of weather event was going on when we got those pictures, or like you were just saying, what went into that during that time frame. And it's a guessing game. You don't know for a fact why they're there all the time for sure, but if you can pick up a little piece here and there, it'll help you when it comes time to set up.
Agreed. Yeah.
Next fall anyway. And now, like I said, now is a killer time to scout because, all the sign is preserved from last fall, and it's much easier to read now than it will be in the middle of the summer. You still learn a lot when you're out there in the summer. So if you can scout, go, regardless of the time of the year, and learn as much as you possibly can. But yeah, when it comes to deer sign, man, that's what we're always looking at, regardless of when we're out there. And it will change somewhat depending on the time of the year. So when we're going in the fall, we're not near as aggressive, obviously, as we are now when it comes to our scouting. But you're still trying to interpret when the sign was laid down. In March, I guess where I'm going with this is in March, I'm trying to interpret when it was laid down last fall. In October, I'm trying to interpret if it was laid down in the last 3 days. But we'll get to that eventually, I'm sure.
Yeah. As you are looking for beds this time of year, I guess, what is your guys' strategy or thought process in going in and looking for various bedding areas. As you mentioned, you're not nearly as aggressive as in the fall. So are there areas that you guys kind of have on a spring scouting checklist of we want to hit that because we couldn't in the fall, and try to go in there and learn more? And what are you trying to learn?
Yeah, I would say we're more aggressive now than we are in the fall. Like, we don't dive into the bedding in the fall. Well, I mean, we do, but we're much more careful. Right now, we just blow right through it all as fast as we can so that we can, learn as much as possible in a short period of time. But, we go into areas, and it all depends on the part of the country that you live in or the specific habitat features involved. But when we're finding beds right now, in a high deer density area like Iowa, for example, we're looking for rubs left in and around the bed to see if it's a buck bed. Like when we're scouting a lot of properties, that's one of the things that we're looking at. And those rubs could be left in September, or they could be a little bit fresher and left later on in the fall. That's not to say that a buck is going to rub right in the edge of his bed all the time, but you're just looking for little clues like that. And they're easier to see now than they are at other times of the year. However, I would say a lot of people can get lulled into finding deer beds right now, bending down and finding a bunch of hair in the bed or whatever, and then thinking, well, deer will bed, in this same spot next October. And that's not necessarily the case. It's possible, but there's a good chance that's going to change a bunch between now and then. So you're still looking for hair in the beds and, that banana-shaped deer bed in melting snow or whatever. They're always going to put themselves up against a piece of cover or in a situation where they can see out front and then have the wind blowing over the top behind them, over a mass of cover or a down log or, But sometimes the fall beds aren't worn in, that they're using right now. So you got to do a little extra detective work. I'll take a stick and dig around in the leaves in a spot until I can maybe comb up some hair. And the deer might not have bedded there for 4 or 5 months, but if I think they were there last November, last October, then we pay attention to that, certainly. And then drop pins on it and everything. It's hard to know specifically what is going on, but the more ground that you cover right now, the more pins you can drop on your map. And every time we find the beds in the bedding area, we sort of reverse engineer it out from there. So we'll turn around and we'll follow those exit trails out of the bedding area. Say you have a half-acre block, thick stuff. There's 30, 40 beds in there, rubs, whatever. We start taking those trails, and there might be 5 or 6 different exit trails heading out of that bedding area in multiple different directions, and we'll follow those trails out and then start cutting sign like where those trails intersect. Maybe a trail goes out towards a creek bottom and then intersects with another cruising trail or a trail that's coming out of a doe bedding area or whatever. But wherever those trails intersect in a staging area or something like that, there's often scrapes right there. So we're marking all that right now specifically, not in the fall so much. I mean, it's postseason when we're going in there and reverse engineering a lot of that intel from the sign, and then we're picking trees, we're checking access routes as well. Basically trying to come up with a plan to kill the deer on that scouting mission that's going to be used in that area. And the sign that's in the actual bedding area is important, but I would argue that the sign along the edges of it in the staging areas is as important or more important than the sign in the bedding area. You got to know that they're there, so you go into the bedding area and you identify, if you believe they were there from last fall. But that staging area sign is the stuff that you can check in hunting season without blowing them out. So,
are you guys using cameras to document any of those exit routes and staging areas from bedding?
Yep.
Yeah, because that's how. I didn't watch the episode. I mean, a lot of obviously everything you guys are doing is documented on the YouTube channel. So I think that your approach to these bedding locations and the stand locations and how you're hunting them. I mean, people can see exactly what you're talking about right here. But the one deer, I think, was it Greg that killed, seemed like that's what you guys did with one of the cell cameras, was set that up, and then Greg went in, boom.
Yep.
Yeah.
Basically, we put that cell cam up in a thick area where Zach had hit a buck last fall. Like, he shot a buck and lost one in there, hit him really high, and we were trying to pick him up again to see if, he survived. And then the deer popped up, and Greg went in there the next day or two and saw him. He wasn't hunting right over the camera, but he was in that area,
right?
And saw that deer. But because we'd already scouted a lot of that stuff, while they were tracking Zach's buck, I mean, they tromped through all those bedding areas, so they kind of knew what the movement was like in that area. So he, got pictures of the deer, knew he was in there, and then went in to go set up on travel routes, leaving the bedding, and killed him.
So 2 questions are, one, when you're that tight, when are you going and actually physically putting those cameras up, and how long are you leaving them? And then how careful are you when you go to check them? I know you guys do a bunch of long-term stuff, but for, just to give some context to folks listening.
Yeah, we'll put stuff up, like if we're out scouting right now, we'll take a camera right now and we'll put it up now, and we'll leave it, all summer and into early fall until about the time we think the batteries are dead, and then we'll go in there and change it, but we don't put a lot, or if we're scouting in late summer or early fall, we'll go in there and burn through a bedding area and cover all that ground and set a camera right in the middle of it to try to understand what's going on after the season. So those we won't touch. We'll set those up on a signpost rub or something in the middle of the thickest bedding. And when we check those after the season, it's just insane, the amount of daylight activity from big deer that it's in there. But it's in that super sensitive area, so it's not one that you can check very often. You got to leave it up there for 6 months and then go back and pick it up. But you can learn an incredible amount of intel from that, like when they were there, what time of year they were there, what they were doing when they were there, and then you can relate that back in future years to come. Now, when we're running them short term, we're running them on those staging areas, signposts and whatnot. That's why I said the staging area sign is just as important, if not more important, than the stuff in the bedding area, because that's the stuff that you can monitor while you're hunting. So we may put a camera 300 yards from a bedding area or 250 yards from it. We may actually go in there like a couple weeks before we plan to hunt and put the camera up, and then get out of there, go back 2 or 3 weeks later on our way in to hunt and check that thing. But the idea behind that is it's going to get any bucks leaving those exit trails out of the bedding area that we'd pre-scouted before. And then we're going to know when we go in that day with a ready to hunt, when we check that card, if a buck is coming out of that particular bedding area. Just judging from the direction that it's facing on those exit trails, it's like, man, if you get him an hour after dark right there at that camera on that trail, there's a good chance he's in that buck bedding area that's 300 yards back there that you've already scouted.
Right.
But you can do that with deer sign as well. So, and you guys talk about this all the time. It's how the whole thing works together, right? The whole plan. You use the cameras in the locations like that, but you can also check rub lines and stuff leading out of that bedding area, or for fresh tracks in the creek or whatever. I mean, you're looking for really, really fresh. If you don't have pictures, if you don't have that intel, you're looking for really, really fresh deer sign in that staging area. That's going to tell you that buck is leaving it probably after dark, but he's leaving it and he's bedding in that bedding area. Otherwise, it wouldn't be there,
Right.
The fresh sign wouldn't be there.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess we're kind of jumping around a little bit on the calendar, but it's all good stuff. When you're going in, and so for instance, when you hang that camera for 3 weeks, kind of like you mentioned, on the outskirts of bedding or on that sign outside of the bedding areas, and you go in and check that camera. You also mentioned before we started recording of just the importance of looking for very hot, fresh sign.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the characteristics of that? I know it sounds like it's probably an easy question, but I don't think there's always a lot of clarification, but it's always a hot button or like a description that is used very often, but without a lot of explanation. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it certainly is. Hot sign is very, very important because that's usually when we start looking for setups, is when we find that close to bedding areas. And when you're looking at hot sign, you're talking specifically about like a fresh rub, maybe, that is on the way out of there. And the reason, like, you can tell if you look at enough rubs. This is the main thing. You got to look at a lot of these things to start to get a feel of when they were left. But if, for example, it's in early October and the leaves are falling and you just had a windy day, maybe 2 or 3 days before your hunt, and it blew down a bunch of maple leaves in a creek bottom. If you're going down through there and you find a real fresh rub, it's bright, you can tell that the bark is still got moisture in it, and there is shavings on top of those maple leaves that fell during that windy day 3 or 4 days before that, then you know that rub's left in the last 3 or 4 days. That's the type of details, though, that we're looking at when it comes to looking at sign. A lot of people will just look and say, oh, there's a rub, but you really need to try to understand when that rub was there. Is it made 3 or 4 weeks ago when the velvet came off, or is it made yesterday night? And you can't tell that to the exact certainty, but like I said, if you're looking at other clues that are going on in the woods, you can start to learn that a little bit. That's just with rubs, though. I'm always looking for that fresh bark on freshly fallen leaves specifically. But then you're also looking at how bright that bark is on the tree, how shiny it is, and how much moisture is still left in it. If it's a sappy tree, for example. And then when it comes to tracks, as tracks will wear, they'll start to round off on the sides a little bit. They won't be as crisp and as sharp in the dirt or in the soil. And I really like getting in creek beds after a rain. Maybe that creek comes up a little bit because of a heavy rain, and then it comes back down. Well, when the water's high in a lot of these creeks we have around here, these sandy, narrow creeks, it'll wash a lot of that sign out of the creek. But then when it comes back down, you have all these little sandbars and stuff that are in it. And if you go out there a day or two after the water goes down, any tracks that you see in that sand are left in those last couple days. Otherwise, they would have been washed out before. And rain is a big deal. Whenever we get a fresh rain, we always are going out the following day or the day after that, and we're looking for fresh people sign in the woods. We're looking for fresh deer sign as far as tracks are concerned, fresh scrapes, because that rain will seal scrapes over. But when you pop back out there after a fresh rain, maybe it rained 2 days ago, and you come across 2 or 3 scrapes that are sealed over that haven't been worked, but then you hit one that is real fresh, and you can see it's obvious that he worked it since that rain. Like that's hot sign. That's the difference between old sign and hot sign, though. Mm-hmm. Is you're really looking at very fine details between all those things to interpret where they're at right now. Big tracks and fresh tracks are probably the most important, but fresh scrapes and rubs are also very important. And beds even to a certain degree. Sometimes if you jump a deer, you can tell if he just got up out of that bed that day.
Mm-hmm. So when you guys are, I guess, doing some of that in-season scouting for that hot sign, where are your starting points? Are you starting like at feeding locations and like kind of backtracking that to those bedding areas you've pre-scouted, or what's your process there?
Pretty often that's how it works.
Yeah.
Sometimes we just skip over the feeding locations and just go straight to the staging areas just to make things a little more efficient. Like say we have 5 bedding areas that we want to hunt on a particular area, and there's one major food source. Well, we may skim over the scrapes along the edge of that field or tracks or whatever real quick, but we'll get through that fairly fast so that we can go and we can start checking those actual staging areas where we may be getting close to hunting, So, but it's reverse engineering it when we head in, and efficiency is always the name of the game, because especially this is the thing that we notice in like high density states like Iowa, for example, where we have a lot of deer and we have a lot of bucks. You may go to most of those bedding areas and find somewhat fresh sign coming out of them in some way, shape, or form. Maybe one of them has way more sign than another one because there's more bucks in that one, right? But there's probably bucks in a lot of them because there's just a lot of deer around here. However, you use that same approach in other states, tougher states with fewer lower deer numbers. Like we were in Mississippi in early January, and we had the same type of efficient approach to scouting sign. 6-7 bedding areas, you go just down the line throughout the day. And you start, a lot of times we'll hunt in the morning and get down at 8 or 9 o'clock, and we'll start walking and scouting those areas immediately after that. And we'll go to one, if there's no fresh sign on the exits, we go to the next one, and to the next one, and to the next one. But then you start picking up on that little stuff like what we were just talking about on those exits. And sometimes it's even browse. In Mississippi, that's what we found. That was some of the fresh sign that we found along the edge. Was there was a trail, but there's not a lot of deer, and the deer don't weigh as much down there, so they don't leave as big of an imprint in the ground when they walk. So the trails are harder to identify. There's a real faint trail leaving this bedding area, and there was some like Japanese privet bushes growing along the edge of it, and you could tell when you walked up to those bushes that they had been getting browsed on a lot, very, very fresh, very frequently in the last few days, because there was fresh deer poop on the ground right there. And that's what I always do with my boot is if there's a deer turd on the ground or something like that, I'll take my boot and I'll roll it around and see how soft it is, see when it was left there. And in this case, they had been browsing on those privet bushes right there in the last few days, and we ended up setting up another 40, 50 yards past that and seeing deer come out of that bedding area that night. But it all relates back to that hot sign. And the other areas that we found that particular day had some sign around them, but it might have been a week old. It might have been rubs that were left a month ago, or a big scrape that was sealed over. It was like, man, the action was really hot here at one time, but it's not today. And that's why we're always on the move.
That makes sense.
One thing that I want to ask kind of specifically, most people who probably or maybe don't have a ton of experience and they're maybe getting out there, the most visual thing is finding a big signpost rub, and people get really excited about it, rightfully so. Can you discuss or share your thoughts on signpost rubs and how your strategy may or may not include signpost rubs? And let's say it's late October late October to the first 3 weeks of November. So, and you come across a giant signpost rub that's been hit
most of the time
within the week or so.
Most of the time, signpost rubs are going to be in locations where there's multiple trails crossing and intersecting. They may be directly in between two bedding areas, and if that is the case, then that's a heck of a good spot to hunt. Because you're in some situations you're still in the security of the transitions in between the bedding areas where bucks feel comfortable moving back and forth to during daylight. But it always seems that those signpost rubs, they're usually older trees, bigger trees that you can see old rubs on multiple sides of the tree, and different rubs made at different times. And that's what, when you find them in March, for example, that's what you're, I guess that's how you're classifying it as a signpost rub, is because there's 2 or 3 directions of travel that intersect at that rub, and you can see that it's been rubbed years past. There's some of those trees like that in the woods that are rubbed every single year, regardless. And they're usually in areas where deer are frequently bedding, or they're close by areas where deer are frequently bedding or frequently feeding, for that matter, because you can definitely find signpost rubs along the edge of a big ag food source or something. But they're always going to be in an area where multiple trails or deer travel patterns intersect. So when it comes to hunting them, it's still equating that back to the bedding in like that security. If it's in the thick stuff, if it's close to bedding areas where you are monitoring a signpost rub, whether it's with a camera or you find it while you're scouting, then and there's a fresh rub on it, then there's a real good chance we're going to hunt that. If it's out along the edge of a food source, though, where there's a ton of deer travel. See, they're doing the same thing, though, when they're leaving it. You know, there's a bunch of deer in the bedding area that are moving around and meandering around, and they're leaving scent, and they're communicating through that rub. And there's a bunch of deer in the feeding area. They're just there at different times. The rub's there for the same purpose, though. It's just equating to where the deer is at, that day when you can hunt them.
Great. I burnt through our outline pretty fast, to be honest.
That's all right.
So, Chad, do you have any questions that you've been sitting on over there all?
I mean, there's a couple thoughts, like with those signpost rubs, where mostly we hunt. Like, I'm going to relate some of this stuff back to some of my personal stuff, but typically we see those on cedar trees because there's not a lot of cedar trees around. But here, in this kind of habitat, there's a lot of cedar trees. There's a lot of soft, different types of aromatic, I guess is the right word. So are you seeing the same thing? Like, are you usually finding those signpost rubs on cedars, or what are you seeing there?
I'd say very often they're on cedars or pines, of some kind. Very often for that reason.
Yeah.
Not every time necessarily. We find them on, we found them on maples before, on like basswood a couple of times, and but the location of them is what's always most consistent.
Right.
However, I've found a lot of big cedar trees with signpost rubs on them, and like I said, there's even some pines around here in different areas where you'll find them.
We had the opportunity to look at one yesterday on Scott's farm, and probably a 14-inch tree.
It's a really big.
I think that was some type of oak.
Yeah.
It was a hardwood, something hardwood.
Yep.
But just exactly what you described.
All directions.
Rubbing in all directions. Old habitual sign, fresh stuff, different heights. So there's multiple different deer hitting it. But it's something like back where we're from, we do find them. There's just the sign is not as prevalent because the deer numbers are lower.
Right.
So when you do find something, then it's a little more sparse. Those pieces, I guess, that you're finding and all the little details are so spread out. It's a lot, I think, a little bit harder to get the entire picture together.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. And that's similar to the example I was using a while ago. Like, you go around Iowa and you check all these staging areas and on these 6-7 bedding areas on a property, and you're gonna find fresh sign at most of them. But you go out there, or you go to Mississippi or one of these other states where the density is lower, and you're not gonna find it, in that type of concentration. But you will still find it.
Right.
It's there. You just have to continue moving and looking for it. And sometimes the amount of fresh sign is far less, that you need to be setting up and hunting over, because people can burn through that stuff too. I mean, I've had that issue in the past where we would hunt in Iowa for a week and we would be dealing with high concentrations of deer sign, and then we would go hunt a different state with a lower population of deer, and my brain would still be trained to be looking for these
Good point.
these stacks of rubs leaving these bedding areas, or these 4 or 5 scrapes along this one trail or whatever, like what I saw in Iowa, and there's just fewer bucks there to leave sign, so naturally there's going to be less sign, and you have to adapt when you move to that type of situation. When it comes to fresh sign too, I think a lot of people will, especially when it's in season, they'll find a bunch of it, and they'll find a bunch of sign. like a bunch of rubs and deer poop and tracks and all that and just say, well, this is where I need to hunt because there's a lot of deer right here. But if that sign is not fresh, a lot of deer might have been there 4 or 5 days ago, especially if and they're not there right now, especially if you're dealing with like acorns, for example, like many people are. Deer will find a tree that is dropping acorns. Like I've seen them in late August on a windy day when I was out scouting. I've seen a few white oaks drop a pile of acorns on that windy day. And I've seen huge bucks eating them at 2 in the afternoon in the middle of 25-mile-an-hour winds because those things are raining out of that tree right then. But in several days, that they may be gone. Like they may clean that up. And they won't necessarily just move on to the next tree that's right next to that one because maybe it doesn't have acorns. They may go across the draw or the drainage that they're bedding in and be feeding on a different acorn tree 400 yards away. So that's why we always hammer that fresh sign. It's like, what is really, really fresh today? That's why we're talking like moisture in the bark on the rub or the bark laying on top of the leaves, or the scrapes made right after a rain, or the buck turd on the ground that you roll over with your boot and it's still mushy and you can tell like it was just left there. Or, with scrapes you'll see sometimes if it hasn't rained and it's dry, you'll see where a buck peed in it that morning or that night. It's like, man, they're right here right now. And you're not necessarily looking for all of those things at once. That'd be great if you find them all. It's like, whoa, man, this is the honey hole. But oftentimes we're setting up on one of those things right next to bedding.
Yep.
And then a buck comes out of there that you get a chance at. That's especially in those lower density areas, a lot of people will be like, well, there's a bunch of bucks in there or whatever. No, I mean, there might be one in there that's going to come out on that trail, and if you blow him out of there, well, then you got to start over. And yeah, that's certainly doable, but you find one. I've passed up fresh sign before, and it's came back to bite us several times, where you find like a really, really fresh buck track on one of those exit trails that's going into the bedding and out of the bedding. You can tell like that the exit tracks were left probably yesterday, and the entry tracks going back in on the same trail were probably left this morning. It's that fresh. So if you're close to bedding, just set up to shoot where that track is. Yeah. I mean, and I know that it was hard for me to do the first few times I found that type of sign, because I'm like, it's one deer track.
Yeah.
You're close to a bedding area. I'm not seeing a bunch of rubs. I don't see a fresh scrape. But then 40 yards later, you jump him, and he was right there, right where you had scouted in March.
Mm-hmm. Do you ever catch it the other way though, where there's so much sign, like, and a lot of it's fresh, like giant bedding area, a lot of different deer, high deer density area, and there's multiple exit trails that have staging sign that's maybe all fresh. Like, do you run into the same issues? Like, oh, I should have, I walked past this fresh sign because I thought, the fresh sign on the next exit trail, or the specific deer maybe that you guys have your eye on, is using. Like, do you catch yourself in that scenario as well?
Oh yeah.
So which one do you think is harder?
Oh, I would say the dealing with lesser sign is more difficult for me anyway. But it certainly gets confusing when you're hunting around here and you get into some of those bedding areas where there may be 6, 7 deer in there, and there's several bucks in and around the bedding area leaving sign. Or maybe in one of those, it seems like if you find locations where there's multiple bedding areas just boom, 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 stacked right on top of each other like that, and you happen to get in between one of them without buggering all the deer, you're going to find a ton of sign right there, just because you've got deer from 3 different bedding areas using this one signpost location where there's a rub or scrape or trail intersection or whatever. But man, if you get into those situations, don't overthink it and just hunt. That's that's my weakness as a hunter, is like I overthink the crap out of things. It helps me at times because I see extra details that others don't. But when it comes time to set up, I go through all that stuff that you're talking about. It's like, man, do I need to go another 20, 30 yards, or do I need to sit right here? because if you're bow hunting, you know that's going to make the difference. It's like, man, he could walk on the other side of that tree from here at 32 yards and I can't shoot him. But if I move up 7 or 8 more yards, I can shoot him. The issue when you get that close is like if you move up 7 or 8 more yards, you may blow him out of there because they're right there. So we're super aggressive, but in the last couple of years, we've started to trust our instincts a little bit better and just set up on fresh sign that is along the edge of those bedding areas, especially in new spots where we don't know exactly where the deer is bedding, which is what happens 90% of the time. Every once in a while, you get in a bedding area and like you know right where he's laying because of your previous scouting. But like they move around in these things all the time. So 90% of the time, you don't know exactly the bed that he's in. You know, you just know there's a real good chance there is a buck in there of interest because of the sign left on the edge. And if there's little human pressure out there and you're within 100, 150 yards of that bedding area, there's a good chance you can set that sign and have luck. You know, it's always a battle, though, trying to decide how far to go.
Yeah, I think it's we talked to a lot of different guys on that topic, and I don't think, like, there's a rule of thumb.
No.
It's just, like, you have to be able to basically screw up enough and to have enough situations underneath your belt where you can see the same things happening again and kind of nip it in the bud or put the odds in your favor, I guess.
Yeah, and that's like what I was saying a while ago about that fresh track going into that bedding area. Jake and I were going in that day, and we knew where the bedding was. It was a very small quarter-acre, like, little drainage in the middle of this CRP field where there was 30 beds in it. I mean, they're in that little swale in that CRP field. They're always right there. And when we went by that track, it's like, well, there's not a bunch of them in here right now. Obviously, there might just be one in here. But if he's in here and we go another 30 yards, we're going to blow him out. So we went just past that track, and we were hemming and hawing around about which tree to try to get in and everything. And I looked up, and he was walking out of the bedding area on that trail. And that was the video that was on the channel where I was at full draw on a really big buck in mid-October on the ground, and he was at like 10 yards, and he busted me, right before I got a chance to shoot him. But if me and Jake would have just set on the track, like he was on that trail that we cut those tracks on, and I know that's the same deer leaving those tracks.
Right.
It was the only buck in that bedding area because after we spooked him, we walked through the middle of the bedding area.
Yeah.
And he was the only one that was in there. But the higher density sign, like what you were talking about, that may just mean that there's multiple bucks in there.
Right.
And if it's a tight bedding area, you're going to run into the same issue if you go too far. You could drive them all out of there, or you could bump one of the satellite bucks and then just set up right there, and the other bucks will stand up and come on out as usual. It's hard to know what exactly is going to happen. It kind of depends on the conditions that day too. If it's windy and wet, like it was on that particular day that we're referring to, it's easier to get even more aggressive because if you do spook a satellite buck out of there, you're not going to be as concerned about him spooking other deer just because they can't hear. They're laying down, it's windy and wet, everything else going on. They may have the deer run right by them and not even know it. If it's calm and crunchy of a morning and a deer stands up and blows out of that bedding area, every deer within a half mile is going to hear him.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's something Dan talks about a lot. Sometimes guys, when they bump deer, they think it's
over,
completely
yeah.
over, but then,
Yep.
we've all seen deer spook for nothing.
Oh, yeah. Coyote run through there. And
yeah.
The night at the buck nest, there were 6-7 does that ran right through the center of that bedding area while me and Zach were hanging the stand. We spooked them, then a coyote chased them through there. And by the time we got the stand set up, it was like, what are we even doing here? This is a joke. And then we filmed 15 bucks. I mean, 5 big giant ones stand up in that same bedding area. They didn't even stand up when the does went through there.
Wild.
So.
It's a good piece of advice. It's easy to lose hope when you're out there like, oh, crap, I screwed it up. I only have Saturday to hunt, and I get out here and I bust a deer right when I walk in. But that's good to know, or for people to stake it out.
Yeah, I would definitely say if it comes a hot sign, man, I mean, don't pass it up. If you're If you're hunting a new area and you don't know the bedding just inside and out, you just kind of have an idea of where it is. Don't overdo it, because we've burned past hot signs several times in our quest to find something better. It's like greener pastures are over there,
Right.
and more often than not, it doesn't happen that way. It's like you end up kicking yourself in the butt because a deer walks out on that trail that you initially thought of to set up on.
That's great. Anything else? I mean, I think that's a lot of quality pieces of info for people to take in consideration on that topic.
I don't know. I hope so, guys. There's been a lot of mistakes made over the years.
Thanks for making those so we can learn from them. Save a few maybe.
Yeah, we've messed up a lot of big bucks. Way more than we've killed. So, but you learn more on those than you do on the ones that you shoot. Seems
I would
like.
agree, yeah. Well, cool. We'll link to your guys' stuff in the description. I don't think there's any
Everybody knows where to find you.
Yeah. Yeah, but we'll definitely link to it. And thank you once again for sitting down with us, giving us the grand tour. We really enjoyed it, and hopefully everyone else will too.
Yeah, guys, no problem at all.